Oh, good afternoon. I wanted to share a bit of a book called Keep Going, The Art of Perseverance. This is written by Joseph P. Marshall III. Okay. He's telling the story that was told to him by his grandfather, Old Hawk. His name was Old Hawk. He's a Lakota man that was in his 80s when he gave this wisdom to his grandson. He said he spoke a little English, but mainly he always spoke in Lakota tongue. So I wanted to read this beginning part. It really looks to be a wonderful, wonderful book with a lot of very good wisdom in it. So let's read this part. A young man asked his grandfather why life had to be so difficult sometimes, and this was the old man's reply. Old Hawk says this: in life there is sadness as well as joy, losing as well as winning, falling as well as standing, hunger as well as plenty, badness as well as goodness. I do not say this to make you despair, but to teach you reality. Life is a journey, sometimes walked in light and sometimes in shadow. Old Hawk says this: you did not ask to be born, but you are here. You have weaknesses as well as strengths. You have both, because in life there is two of everything. Within you is the will to win as well as the willingness to lose. Within you is the heart to feel compassion as well as the smallness to be arrogant. Within you is the way to face life as well as the fear to turn away from it. Old Hawk says this: life can give you strength. Strength can come from facing the storms of life, from knowing loss, feeling sadness and heartache, from falling into the depths of grief. You must stand up in the storm. You must face the wind and the cold and the darkness. When the storm blows hard, you must stand firm, for it's not trying to knock you down. It is really trying to teach you to be strong. Old Hawk says this: being strong means taking one more step toward the top of the hill, no matter how weary you may be. It means letting the tears flow through grief. It means to keep looking for the answer, though the darkness of despair is all around you. Being strong means to cling to hope for one more heartbeat, for one more sunrise. Each step, no matter how difficult, is one more step closer to the top of the hill. To keep hope alive for one more heartbeat at a time that leads to the light of the next sunrise and the promise of a new day. Old Hawk says this: the weakest step toward the top of the hill, toward sunrise, toward hope, is stronger than the fiercest storm. Old Hawk says, keep going. Okay, so that's the start of the book. So I'm going to read also the prologue to this. The question. A few years ago, a young man named Jeremy learned that his father, Jeremy Sr., had cancer. The doctors warned the young Jeremy and his family that the disease had not been detected in its early stages. Nevertheless, as people often do in the face of obvious hopelessness, the young man and his family prayed for a miracle. The doctors, for their part, did the best they could, but the surgery and the subsequent Treatment only seemed to exasperate an already difficult situation. Jeremy helplessly watched as his father's condition deteriorated swiftly, and he wasted away. The miracle his family desperately hoped for did not come. On a cool spring night, Jeremy's father departed on his journey to the spirit world. And in the months that followed, the young man was beset by a swirl of grief, confusion, and anger. Questions and issues about life and death overwhelmed him. As a teacher of history, Jeremy spent his time and energy for 9 months of the year on students, lesson plans, reading and correcting papers, and an apathetic principal more concerned with policy and dotting I's and crossing T's than in replacing woefully outdated texts. Jeremy relished the summers when he could play softball and read books he didn't have time for during the school year. As a teacher, he was experienced enough to write lesson plans and endure the mountains of paperwork, and was mostly successful in engaging students invariably turned off by history. And he somehow looked forward to crossing intellectual swords with the principal to face the challenge of the man's obstinacy and narrow-mindedness. But as a young man, he had already learned that life and death were realities for which there were no easy answers. Jeremy knew only one thing for certain. He had not lived long enough to find the right answers. So he reached out to the one person in his life who always seemed to have an answer. To his friends, he was known as Old Hawk, but to his family, he was simply Grandpa. Old Hawk was well past 80. He'd never traveled more than 400 miles in any direction from where he had been born. But that mattered little, because, as Old Hawk knew well, life itself was the greatest journey. Old Hawk knew that the roads traveled in this life imparted lessons that experientially, emotionally, and spiritually were greater than the number of hills climbed or the borders crossed. They were greater than the turns made or the horizons waiting ahead. He knew that the most important and enduring lessons came from the difficult roads, those that twist and turn, are narrow and dark, and are filled with challenges and obstacles. Roads easily traveled offer no travail, and therefore no sense of achievement, because anything easily attained offers little value in return. Old Hawk had no formal education to speak of, and though he knew a little English, he preferred the family and the familiarity of his native tongue. His hair was gray, and his face weathered from sun and storm. The rich brown hue of his skin was testament to his native heritage. His hands were still strong enough, though bent and scarred from a lifetime of hard work. In his life, Old Hawk had plowed and planted, was a trainer of horses, a hunter, a builder of homes. He had lost count of the thousands of post holes he had dug to build fences, and likewise the number of posts he had placed in the earth. He had known disappointment, heartache, sadness, and loss, as well as the satisfaction of a job well done, and the resolve of clinging to his beliefs and principles in the face of temptation and ridicule. In many, many ways, he was like most men, most people. But to Jeremy, Old Hawk was his grandfather, and therefore like no other. Two characteristics always drew Jeremy to his grandfather: a quiet demeanor and a steady gaze in his eyes no matter what the situation. Jeremy had spent most of his formative years with his grandparents, and he could not remember a single instant during childhood when his grandfather had raised his voice in anger. No matter what the problem, crisis, or circumstance, the old man always faced it with a quiet resolve. Perhaps that was the reason there was always peacefulness in his eyes, like the stillness of a deep, quiet pool of water. So one day, Jeremy went to his grandfather carrying his grief and confusion as if it were all the heartache of the world. The old man took him to the shade of an old cottonwood tree, where they sat and listened to the gentle rustling of the soft breeze among the trees and leaves. Since I was a boy, the sounds of cottonwood leaves in the wind remind me of my mother's voice, Old Hawk began. But then again, somehow it could also be the voice of God. Jeremy listened for several moments, but for the life of him, all he could hear was leaves rustling. So, grandson, the old man went on, I can see by the look on your face that you are troubled. There seems to be something pulling down at your heart. So the young man asked his question. It was the same question he had asked several times before and in many different ways, but the anguish and confusion from which it came was always the same. Grandpa, why is life so difficult? And so that's the prologue and the beginning wisdom of what grandfather was saying. And it says that the author, Joseph Marshall, is a Sikangu Lakota, born and raised on the Rosebud Sioux Reservation. So he's been a teacher, education, health program administration for the Rosebud Sioux tribe, one of the founders, a charter board member of the Sinte Gleska University. So anyway, he's a very well-known author. His writing style seems to be quite interesting, and it looks to be that there will be quite a bit of excellent wisdom for life from Old Hawk, his grandfather. So if you're interested in hearing more of this, let me know. It's called Keep Going, The Art of Perseverance. The Lakota have a vision that transcends the ages, and Joseph Marshall delivers it with grace and power. That's what it says. It might be a book that you actually would like to have for your library. It looks to be one that might be people might want to pick up quite often. Looks like it has some very good wisdom in it. So, aho, have a great evening.